It's a tale that's been told to local children here since grade school. A historical event that would alter the course of Ohio's future. A single death so cruel that it would turn the fledgling nation of the United States against all natives living in the Ohio Territory. And as with many things in the history of my remote kingdom, it all began with the river. In 1782, General William Irvine persuaded General William Crawford to lead an expedition against enemy Native American villages along the Sandusky River. Before leaving on May 16th, he made out his will and testament. His son John Crawford, his son-in-law William Harrison, and his nephew and namesake William Crawford also joined the expedition. His orders were simple. Find the Sandusky River and destroy any native villages or settlements he uncovered there. After finding the river, Crawford and his men headed north in search of Upper Sandusky. At the time, the settlement often moved with the seasons and weather, the tribes moving in and out of the floodplain or hunting grounds. This river was a map, a business, and the secret to navigating Northwest Ohio trade routes all the way into the Great Lakes. For years, settlers in the Ohio Valley had agitated for punitive raids against the Ohio tribes along the Sandusky River. Their goal was to retaliate for the Indian raids across Ohio and spoil future raids. By the spring of 1782, they could not be restrained. After militia had massacred defenseless natives in Manhattan in March, Brigadier General William Irvine, the Continental Commander at Pittsburgh, arranged for Colonel Crawford to lead the inevitable militia expedition, likely in hopes that Crawford could prevent a repeat. Crawford had taken no part in the Manhattan massacre. Crawford led about 500 volunteers deep into the wilderness-covered American Indian Territory with the hopes of surprising them. However, the Indians and their British allies in Detroit had learned about the expedition in advance, and brought about 440 men to the Sandusky to oppose the Americans. Crawford was heading into a trap. The Delaware Nation tribes tortured and executed many of the men in retaliation for the Manhattan massacre earlier in the year, in which 96 Indian men, women, and children had been murdered by Pennsylvania militiamen in an ongoing drawn-out blood feud that the natives had no chance of ever actually winning. Crawford met the Indian resistance on the Sandusky River on June 4th, near Upper Sandusky. The fighting lasted 2 days in a valley just north of where the town currently is, with no clear conclusion. But things did not bode well for the militia. As the militia grew weaker, the Native Americans, largely from the Wyandot, Delaware, and Shawnee nations, grew stronger. On the night of June 5th to 6th, a planned withdrawal by the militia turned into a rout, and Crawford was separated from his command. He linked up with a small party and eventually started eastward, bound for the Ohio River. On June 7th, Delaware Indians caught Crawford and his party en route. The Delaware returned them to the Sandusky, heading for a settlement near Timocty Creek, a few miles from the battlefield and north of today's Upper Sandusky. Along the way, they encountered the bodies of the expedition, many of whom were killed on the way back to the Sandusky. By the 10th, it was clear that Crawford would suffer a similar, albeit more gruesome, fate. Having suffered beatings since his capture, Crawford was to be burned at the stake. Knight, one of Crawford's men and witness to his execution, took up the narrative. When we were come to the fire, the colonel was stripped naked, ordered to sit down by the fire, and then they beat him with sticks in their fists. Presently, after I was treated in the same manner. Then they tied a rope to the foot of a post about 15 feet high, bound the colonel's hands behind his back, and fastened the rope to a ligature between his wrists. The rope was long enough either for him to sit down or walk around the post once or twice and return the same way. The Indian men then took up their guns and shot powder into the colonel's body, from his feet as far up to his neck. I think not less than 70 loads were discharged upon his naked body. Then they crowded about him, and to the best of my observation cut off his ears. When the throng had dispersed a little, I saw blood running from both sides of his head in consequence thereof. The fire was about 6 or 7 yards from the post to which the colonel was tied. It was made of small hickory poles, burnt quite through in the middle, each of the poles remaining about 6 feet in length. 3 or 4 Indians by turns would take up individually one of these burning pieces of wood and apply it to the naked body, already burnt black with the powder. These tormentors presented themselves on every side of him, so that whichever way he ran around the post they meet him with burning faggots and poles. Some of the squaws took up boards upon which they would put a quantity of burning coals and hot embers and throw them on him, so that in a short time nothing but coals of fire and hot ashes were there to walk upon. Colonel Crawford at this period in his suffering besought the Almighty to have mercy on his soul, spoke very low, and bore his torments with the most manly fortitude. He continued in all the extremities of pain for 1 hour and 3/4 or 2 hours longer, as near as I can judge, when at least being almost spent, he lay down on his belly. They then scalped him and repeatedly threw the scalp in my face. An old squaw got aboard, took up a parcel of coals and ashes and laid them upon his back, and headed after he had been scalped. He then raised himself upon his feet and began to walk around the post. They next put a burning stick to him as usual, but he seemed more insensible to pain than before. Dr. Knight was hauled away before the bitter end with the promise that the Shawnee to the south would do the same to him. On his way the next day, Knight passed the execution site and saw Crawford's remain laying in the ash. All that was left was some fragments of charred bone. The doctor eventually escaped, making his way to the Ohio River. He was found and taken to Fort McIntosh and then arrived in Pittsburgh on July 5th. There, local attorney Hugh Brackenridge recorded his account, edited it, and rushed it into print. Knight's narrative, as originally published, dominated histories for 200 years until historian Parker Brown reassessed it voraciously. Brown called out Brackenridge's ulterior motives for getting the narrative into print, producing a story that would sell, stirring up the local populace to rise up against aggressively and resist marauding Indian war parties, and shaming Eastern authorities into dispatching additional resources to the frontier. According to Brown, to do this, Brackenridge accented every gruesome aspect of Crawford's ordeal. Brown critiqued Brackenridge for leaving out context and taking in some liberties with the facts, but he did not dispute the fundamental acts involved in torturing Crawford to death, such as beating the colonel, firing loads of gunpowder into his body, hitting him with burning poles, covering him in ash, or scalping him. Crawford's execution was brutal, and it was also overseen by Simon Girty, a former soldier under Crawford's command who deserted his post after being wanted for high treason in 1778 for acting as an enemy of the state while serving in the militia. The order was signed by Timothy Matlock and George Bryan. The American Revolutionary War raged on, but here in the Ohio country the fighting wasn't about distant politics. It was about revenge, survival, and blood. Colonel Crawford, a respected officer, found himself at the mercy of the Delaware and Wyandot warriors. What followed is remembered as one of the most agonizing deaths in early American history. Captured after his failed expedition, Crawford was led to the Delaware town of Timothy. A crowd gathered, men, women, and children, To witness a punishment meant not only for Crawford, but for all who brought destruction to their villages. This was not meant to be quick. It was meant to be justice. The torture went on for hours. His body was burned, slashed, and blackened. Whenever he fell, he was propped back up so the torment could continue. Colonel William Crawford's death shocked the frontier. To the Americans, it was martyrdom. To the Wyandot in Delaware, it was vengeance for the countless atrocities inflicted upon their people. The problem was the brutal, vulgar nature of their revenge. Crawford had nothing to do with earlier massacres, and that they used as justification for their actions, and the nature of his death only served to rally Americans along the East Coast to want to completely eradicate all natives from the land, which is exactly what would come to pass. A memorial now marks the site where Crawford was burned. The actual burn site is not where the current marker stands, but remains on private land not accessible to the public. Both are a reminder that this land was soaked in blood, both native and settler, during America's violent birth. Blood that flowed as freely as the river it was spilled on. Within 50 years of Crawford's death, almost all natives in the state had been moved into reservations or completely relocated out west, as the Ohio Territory was flooded with white settlers. The Wyandot Indians would come to be the last organized native tribe in Ohio before they were forcibly removed and relocated to Kansas and Oklahoma in 1843. Just 40 years after Crawford's death, Tiffin would be settled and founded on the banks of the Sandusky River 13 miles north of where Crawford was killed, and would be well established heading into the Civil War, which began in 1861. In 1864, my family would settle into the area, and we have been here ever since. Today, learning stories such as how Crawford was burned at the stake, or Seneca John being the only person in Ohio history to be executed by his own brothers for witchcraft, almost feels like forbidden knowledge of the events that took place on the very ground I live, work, and play on. And so many of these tales take place a stone's throw from the river I sat on the banks of and cross every single day. It's knowledge that gives you a deeper connection to the land itself, its sacred sites, its historical relevance, and the blood that still sits deep in the earth, waiting for the next wanderer to recount its story. That's the secret to immortality. So long as one person remains to tell the tale, the souls who are involved in it will live on.
What do you want from me? Why don't you run from me?